Welcome to the Carbon mini-series within the Exploring Opportunities podcast, brought to you as part of the Future Farm Resilience support delivered by NIAB, AKC and Savills working in partnership. My name's Elizabeth Stockdale, Head of the Farming Systems team in NIAB. Today we're going to explore the science behind ruminant methane emissions with Professor Laim Sinclair from Harper Adams University. Hello, Laim.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. My background's as a soil scientist and farming systems researcher. I've usually worked in arable systems. So when I think of mixed systems and work with mixed systems, I tend to think about those livestock perhaps in the same way as you would do as soil, where you put something in the front and get something different out the back. But before we get into the complexity of that and you get me clear on how this works, can you just give us a brief introduction to your background and what brought you into the study of livestock?
Yeah, sure. I was born and brought up on a family farm in the north of Scotland, so a mixed farm, cattle, sheep and cereals. And so I had an interest from very early on in terms of ruminant animals. I was then fortunate enough to do well at school, so I could go to university, and I did agriculture with animal science, which sort of grew my interest in cattle and sheep and how they can digest feed, how they can use feeds that we as humans cannot use, so byproduct feeds and forages, and how to do that more efficiently. So then I went and did a PhD in rumen biochemistry at Nottingham University because I still didn't understand everything that was going on. So I did my PhD, and that made me even more curious to find out other things that were important in terms of ruminant production, ruminant nutrition, forage use, quality of milk, those kind of things. So it's been a kind of family thing. It's something that's kind of grown through, and just an interest I have in cattle and sheep.
So over the past few years, ruminant animals have come into the focus, particularly around methane and methane emissions. Why this focus on methane, and why have we suddenly become interested in it?
Yeah, I think it's perhaps a rather complicated story as to why the focus has come on to methane and ruminants, because we've had ruminants really since when we started domesticated agriculture about 10,000 years ago, and they've been with us for a number of reasons. First of all, they're able to use feeds that we can't use, so fibrous feeds, forages, and convert that into high quality protein and energy, milk and meat. And they're able to upgrade low quality proteins into high quality proteins as well. So they've been with us, cattle and sheep have been with us for a long time, and they've been a very important part of human development. In that process of digesting fibre, they also produce this compound called methane. And that's where the focus has come in recently in terms of global warming, because methane has got quite a high global warming potential. Depends on how you calculate it, which we might discuss a little bit later. So the focus has been on the production of methane. And I think it's perhaps been rather unfairly so. If we look at the UK dairy industry, in the 1980s, we had about 3.4 million dairy cows producing about 15 billion litres of milk. Now we've got 1.9 million dairy cows producing 15 billion litres of milk. So even without going into any of the science or calculations on terms of methane, I think anybody can see quite clearly that there's been a reduction in the amount of methane that's being produced because we've got nearly half the number of cows. And over that period of time, there's been a large increase in air transport and people going on holidays and cars, people having more cars, etc. So in many ways, I feel it's been unfair that ruminants have been focused on, because certainly in the UK, their net contribution has been to reduce the amount of methane that's being produced. But the focus for many legislators has been on this high global, what we call global warming potential, which for methane is about 25 times more than carbon dioxide. But as I said,
So if we just do that and global warming potential, then that's us expressing the impact of any other gas in the atmosphere in relation to carbon dioxide, isn't it?
That's right. It's a way of taking other gases. So agriculture produces other gases such as nitrous oxide and methane, and it's a way of converting them into common currency, if you like.
Hmm.
And that is to base it on the effect that if it was just carbon dioxide, how much carbon dioxide would that be? That's what we call the global warming potential, or GWP, in terms of the official way of calculating it.
Hmm.
And that gives methane about 25 times the impact.
So I think that relates to how long that effect lasts in the atmosphere, doesn't it? And whether the standard way of calculating it is really being fair on how methane works.
Yeah, I think particularly methane from ruminants. There's
Hmm.
what's called GWP star, which has been proposed by researchers, Miles Allen, the most prominent at Oxford University, that says, well, hold on a minute. The methane might have a high global warming potential, but it's actually got a very short, what we call half-life. So if you have a cow now and she's putting out methane, it does have a high global warming effect in terms of heating the environment. But after about 10 years or so, that methane has degraded and it's gone. So you're not actually contributing. So that cow after 10 years has no net contribution.
Hmm.
So if you have a stable UK dairy population, or a sheep population, or beef cattle population, then you're not actually contributing to increased amounts of methane. And as I mentioned previously with the UK dairy industry, if it's decreasing, you're actually contributing towards global cooling, which may seem a rather bizarre thing to say, because everybody thinks the opposite. So it depends on how you calculate it. And I know that there's a lot of farmers get quite annoyed that we don't use GWP star, but that's really to do with legislators and a sort of common currency across the globe. So it makes it a little bit more complicated to say what the net effect is from agriculture, compared with burning fossil fuels, for example, where you're releasing carbon that's been stored for a long period of time, and you're releasing that into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, which is building up over time.
And we've had a different podcast talking about N2O emissions, which absolutely don't really break down. They break down incredibly slowly in the stratosphere. There are no consuming processes at all. So that one has a very high GWP, and I think also has that long duration, which is very different to methane. But as you say, it's about bringing these gases together so we can start to talk, whether it's useful or not, about things like carbon footprints, and have a look across a whole farm system at how the different sorts of emissions might fit together. Do you have a sense, and there is no reason you should have, but do you have a sense of how important, if we look at a livestock farm, how important methane is as a proportion of the different kinds of greenhouse gases coming from a farm?
Yeah, I mean, if I use the example of a dairy cow, then a litre of milk produces somewhere in the region of 1,200 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's
Hmm.
this equivalent value. So 1,200 grams would be a standard cow. And of that, about 40% or so would be coming from methane produced by the cow. And the rest of it's coming from feed use, a little bit from nitrous oxide in terms of you've got electricity in other forms. So about 40% or so. So it's a big component within ruminants. And
Okay.
that's why people focus on it, is to say, well, you've got this large amount of methane.
Yeah, so that's really useful. So if we go back to the science, why do ruminant animals produce methane and not the rest of us? What's actually going on, the processes in the rumen that lead to these emissions?
The really fascinating thing about cattle and sheep is the ability to break down this fibre and use feeds that we can't use. But in reality, cattle and sheep don't contain enzymes to do that. They're not able to break it down any more than what you or I or your dog or cat, they're not able to break it down either, which seems a little bit bizarre that cattle and sheep cannot digest grass, but they don't. What they've done is that they've evolved this relationship with microorganisms within the rumen. And within a sheep, it's somewhere about 10 to 15 litres worth of rumen material. In a dairy cow, it's about 150 litres. So they've got these big fermentation vats that the cow or the sheep puts a lot of effort into carrying around and maintaining. And the benefit is that within this rumen, you've got a large amount of microorganisms such as bacteria, fungi, and protozoa. So there are more bacteria in 1 milliliter of rumen fluid, for example, than the number of people in the world. So if you multiply that up to say, well, there's 150 litres in a cow, you can see that there's a vast a number in there. And what these microorganisms do is that they do contain the enzymes to break down fibre within the rumen. So feed comes into the rumen, they're able to break that down, and it's what we call an anaerobic environment. It means that there's no oxygen. So they ferment it within the rumen. Mm-hmm. And some farmers may have anaerobic digestion plants, and it's not too dissimilar from a mobile anaerobic digestion plant. And they break it down, they gain energy from the fibre that we can't do. And then some of that energy is available for the cow or the sheep then to use, which they use to make meat and milk. And then the bugs themselves, they get washed out of the rumen as feed's coming in the mouth, and they get washed out of this first stomach. And the cow's got 4 stomachs, the rumen being the largest, but it gets washed out, and then those rumen microbes are digested in themselves. So the animal gets the protein from these microbes, because they're packed full of protein, 50-60% protein. So they're high protein source. So the wonderful thing is that these bugs make the ruminants able to use feeds that we can't use. They're able to upgrade low quality protein feeds. The downside is, in the process of doing that, they produce this gas called methane. And as I said, they always have produced methane. This hasn't just happened in the last 20 or 30 years. It's been with us when bison grazing the plains of North America and elk and others, they all produce methane. And that methane is necessary to be produced for the fermentation to occur within the rumen. The actual problem in the rumen isn't really methane. The actual problem is another gas called hydrogen. And the rumen needs to get rid of hydrogen. So there's a special group of bacteria that we call archaea, and they're able to take the hydrogen and convert it into methane. So they get rid of the hydrogen by doing that. So really, in terms of what we're trying to do to reduce methane, it's often about using some other source to use the hydrogen in there. So this methane is something that the farmer doesn't really want to be produced, because it's about 8% or so of the feed that you give an animal is lost as methane. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit like a farmer, giving their animals feed and then taking 8% of it and throwing it away. And that's how much energy is lost. So farmers don't want to lose that energy. They want it to be converted into live weight gain, if it's sheep or cattle or milk production, mm-hmm. rather than it to be lost. And that was the focus about 40, 50 years ago, when people started looking at reducing methane then. And there were products such as monensin, which some of the older farmers might be familiar with in terms of rumensin and other products in there. And they were introduced really to as growth promoters and to promote milk production. And the way that they did it was to reduce methane. And then that methane energy was used in terms of growth and milk production. We don't use those in the UK now, but they are used widely throughout the rest of the world as a means of a growth promoter, and it does it by reducing methane. If we can reduce the amount of methane that's produced, then we will have more efficient animals and they'll produce more. So everything in terms of reducing methane is something that a farmer would want to do anyway, and we can explore some ways of how they do that as we talk through. So it's not something that farmers want, but it is a natural product that's been there for millions of years. And the upside is that ruminants can use products that we can't use, that might be byproducts from the human feed industry, such as sugar beet pulp or distillers' grains from bioethanol, or it may be grazing pastures where we can grow combinable crops on as well. So it's a balance between those two.
So I think you're hinting that manipulating perhaps the quality or different things we might put in feeds can have a big impact. But before we go there, are there any differences between the species of ruminant animals, breeds within a species, or even between individual animals in how this methane emissions work? Do we know anything about that variation?
Yeah, there is a difference between sheep and cattle. They roughly respond the same. but not always. So sometimes
Mhm.
you'll find one feed additive might work better in sheep than in another, than in cattle, in terms of reducing methane production. We know that there's a big variation in the genetics between animals. So
Mhm.
you can have two beef animals growing at the same rate, 1 kilogram per day, and eating the same amount, but one could be producing 20% more methane than another one. And there's a lot of interest in terms of selecting animals to produce less methane
Mhm.
naturally as well. So we know that there's that genetic variation there, and there's the opportunity to select animals to be more efficient. But there are other ways of improving efficiency as well as
So
that genetic
I guess
selection.
that genetic selection is going to feed through breeding programs, and it's not something farmers themselves will be doing, because they won't be making those measurements to know the differences between animals, though they may be picking differences that are a result of methane in different performance in terms of live weight gain, if that makes sense, because perhaps an animal that's producing less methane is also able to use feed a little bit better, and hence growing faster. But that's likely to feed through, I guess, just in our purchases of livestock going forward, in breeding material that comes forward onto farms, and selection that way.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we're involved with a large project coordinated by SRUC, where it is specifically to evaluate the genetic variation in sheep and sheep breeds on methane production.
Hmm.
AHDB also has an index in there that you can breed for animals that have got a lower methane production. And genomics and genomic selection and identifying key genes are things that will become more prominent as we move forward. And farmers will really only see that in terms of when they're buying replacement stock, in terms of bulls and particularly semen, and they'll be able to increasingly select animals that have a lower methane production or genetically have a lower methane production. But there are other factors rather than just specifically selecting for methane. For example, things that increase longevity, etc., will contribute towards reducing methane production as well. So farmers won't see it. The difficulty, and often I find when I discuss it with farmers, the frustration is that everybody speaks about methane. They're being criticised for methane, but it's difficult to measure, if not impossible to measure on commercial
Hmm.
farms, to know if they are producing high levels or lower levels. And there are calculators to calculate what your carbon footprint is, but they're based on sort of standard equations rather than what an individual farmer is doing. So it's always difficult in those situations to either reward or penalise for methane production if you can't measure how much has actually been produced. You're just predicting how much has been produced.
Hmm.
And that can be a little bit frustrating for farmers as well. So they may select animals that have got a predicted have a lower methane production, but measuring whether that's the case on their farm is more difficult to do.
Okay, so we sort of touched on feed and then dropped back, and then so we'll go back in and say, okay, so is it about then, for a farmer, selecting the balance of feeds, or about feed additives, or both?
Well, I would, in terms of reducing methane, I'd put them into two categories. You've got nutrition, and then you've got kind of management aspects that can contribute
Hmm.
towards it. If we take nutrition, then there are aspects that farmers can do that will contribute towards lower methane production. And those things are sort of higher quality forages. The more fiber you have in the diet, the lower the quality of the forage, then the more methane is produced. The higher the quality of the forage, then the less the methane. And also, a higher quality forage results in a higher growth rate or a higher milk production. So it has a double effect. Not only do you get less methane produced with a higher quality forage, but you get a greater live weight gain or a greater milk production. So when you express the production of methane or carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of live weight gain or per kilogram of milk yield, then you have this double effect. You've got less with a higher quality forage, and you've got more product coming out. So it actually reduces the impact or the footprint per kilogram of product by a greater extent. So improving forage quality is one way of doing that. Grass is quite good. Not only is grass lower in fibre, but it also contains what we call polyunsaturated fatty acids in there. And polyunsaturated fatty acids, when they get into the rumen, they can absorb hydrogen, and that can reduce the hydrogen available for methane production. And they can also be a little bit selective in terms of what bacteria are present in there as well. So grazing high quality grass is good as well. And we've done studies where we've allowed cows to graze even for just a few hours a day. And we've seen a reduction in methane production of about 10 to 14% from doing that. Other things, starchier feeds tend to reduce methane. That's because of the fermentation that's going on within the rumen, and it's less in fibre as well. So feeding higher levels of concentrates tends to reduce methane. But there's a bit of a caveat on there. So a dairy farmer going from, say, 3 kilograms per day to 4 kilograms per day probably won't see much effect. You have to feed quite high levels before you see an effect. And then you have a risk of negative effects such as acute ruminal acidosis, too low a rumen pH, if you overfeed concentrates. But starchier feeds in there tend to reduce methane. So feeding maize silage, for example, has a benefit over grass silage because it's got a higher starch content and because cows tend to produce more milk as well as the direct effects on methane production. So there's a variety of different things in terms of the control in relation to what's currently being fed. Mm-hmm. But there's also a lot of interest now in specific products that will reduce methane production. DEFRA are a little bit concerned that it's a bit of a sort of wild west out there to a certain extent in terms of products available. Mm-hmm. And it's making sure that there's good sound evidence for whatever's being used actually has an effect. So there's a variety of products that are either on the market or coming on the market. So things such as essential oils have been shown to reduce methane production by several percent. There's a product that's likely to be coming onto the market called 3-nitrooxypropanol, and that reduces methane production by up to about 30% or so. Nitrates, which is not something we would normally want to feed ruminants because they can have negative effects as well, but in controlled conditions and fed appropriately, they can reduce methane as well. A lot of plant-based compounds in there that people have been looking at, tannins, saponins, other individual compounds. You've then got sort of seaweed products in there, bromate products in there as well as means of reducing methane. So there's a lot of potential out there. And I'm just a little bit concerned that farmers aren't sold products without having good, strong evidence that they work, because some of them are more effective than others. And there are things such as adaptation in the rumen to a certain extent. The rumen is quite good at adapting to some of these products as well.
So what sort of question should a farmer ask when a feed salesman says, you really need to buy this thing to make a difference? What's the good question that a farmer could ask to challenge the evidence?
Yeah, it's has there been independent evidence done, particularly if it's been published in what we call peer-reviewed articles, because that tends to be a better way. It's not a fail-safe way, but it tends to be a better way of ensuring that the work's been done properly, rather than it's easy to do, say, an on-farm study and have one group of animals in one building, one group in another building, but that isn't really very good science. So it's having good, solid science, not just from one piece of work, but a number of different pieces of work that all indicate towards it having an effect. And there are some products out there that that has been a lot of work on, and there's good evidence for. But there's others out there that's perhaps not as clear in terms of what effect they have, and simply being marketed to have an effect. And in theory, whether they should have an effect, and in practice, that may not be the case. So, for example, some companies may do studies in what we call in vitro or in test tubes effectively and show an effect on methane. But that doesn't always translate to what may happen in a sheep. And they may do it in a sheep, but that may not translate to what happens in a cow. So if you're buying a product and there's no evidence, be really concerned. If it's just laboratory measurements in vitro, then that may not translate through. And it comes back to this aspect of, if you're not measuring it on the farm, you don't actually know whether what you've bought is having a benefit or not, because you're not able to measure the methane production. You're just basing it on the evidence there. And governments, not just the UK, but throughout the world, want that evidence. So if they do include that within carbon footprint calculators, that there is sound evidence to suggest what that effect might be.
Excellent. Now, we could go on talking for ages, but we kind of need to pull things to an end. We may come back at some point in the future to say we need to know more, Liam. But if you had to give one message to farmers with ruminant livestock, sheep, cattle, both beef and dairy, but that you're going to give them each a different message, what would that sort of general, what should they be focused on at this point? What would you want them to take out of all this conversation about methane and managing methane on farm?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't. I would put over the point that reducing methane is something that farmers would want to do anyway, because it will improve your performance. Nutrition is one area that we've touched on. The other area is sort of general management. So having, for example, heifers calving at 23, 24 months rather than 27, 28 months. Because when an animal's not producing anything, it's still belching out methane. And as it's belching out methane, then that's contributing towards the overall effect. So, for example, I said about 20-25% of the carbon cost of a litre of milk actually comes from rearing the animal before it calves for the first time. So that's kind of a dead time, really, in terms of methane production. So you want that animal calving and at 23, 24 months, not hanging around. And the same goes for beef and for sheep as well. Finishing at a younger age, meeting these sort of market targets is important. Other areas include, improving fertility. So making sure that cows are getting in calf, that you've got a high conception rate, high heat detection rate. The same with sheep as well. And suckler cows, that you've got 90 to 95% in the calf rate. And health is another area. So reducing, lameness in sheep, reducing mastitis, any reasons to cull animals is also going to improve that, because the longer living, healthier, more productive animals are the ones that produce less methane. So those are all things that farmers would want to do anyway.
So old-fashioned good animal husbandry then is key to this.
Yes, absolutely. And that will feed through in terms of profitability as well as reducing methane production. And then you can overlay that in terms of additives in there, including oils, including specific products in there to reduce methane if there's evidence and there's sound evidence that that's the effect. So that's kind of on top of that. So my comments would be get the basics right first in terms of management, in terms of forage management and balanced diet that's done correctly. So you're not overfeeding nutrients and that you're meeting the targets in terms of live weight gain or milk production. And then you've got your additives on top of that to reduce methane further. But if you're not getting those other basics right, then you're going to be paying for products and you could have had as much an effect in doing something else as well.
Thank you. And it's been really interesting. I certainly understand a bit more about that thing that I call a black box, that feels to me a lot like my understanding as well of those complicated biological interactions in the soil and the rumen. So perhaps actually in the future, we need to think more about how those two things might work most effectively together. And I know there are conversations about what we call the phytobiome, aren't there? They're understanding those complicated interactions between animals, plants, soil, and our whole human health too. But that's for another day. Thank you very much for your time today, and see you soon.
Okay, thank you very much.